Minister, ladies and gentlemen, members, ambassadors, dear friends and members and supporters of Bruegel, thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you very much for being with us tonight, and for not only being with us tonight, but also for supporting our work in various capacities in the course of the year. I'm delighted to welcome you to our annual dinner here tonight, which we have the pleasure of having in this wonderful room with a beautiful panorama view. I think it will get even more beautiful as the lights go on and it will become dark outside. So let me extend a very warm welcome also on behalf of the entire Bruegel team to you. Thank you for being here. We have the pleasure tonight of listening to a keynote speech by Minister Kažimír, which will be introduced and chaired by our chairman, Bruegel's chairman, Jean-Claude Trichet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Guntram. Thank you to all of us here, because as said Guntram, we are very privileged to have so many friends, so many supporters, so many members, so many ambassadors, so many high responsible, and this is the great tradition of this dinner. I have to say that you never managed, Guntram, to organize the dinner in such a place, which is absolutely wonderful, and I expect that a number of us didn't know the place. So as you said, we are immensely privileged to have with us the Minister of Finance of Slovakia. And I have to say that you're here, dear Peter Kažimír, in a situation which is really extraordinary, because at the beginning of this year, we had a lot of bad news accumulating since during your own presidency, by the way, namely Brexit, namely the election in the United States of America, many challenges of all kinds, and the mood was very negative, frankly speaking, on Europe. Everybody was expecting that a number of continental European countries would follow the Anglo-Saxon direction or path, as had been the case in the past. So there was very negative projection on the Dutch election, on the French election, perhaps even on the German election. So all this is over. I have the memory of your presidency of Europe. Slovakia demonstrated a formidable capacity to hold in a very difficult situation, obviously, and to maintain the spirit of Europe, the spirit of the European construction, in being not only the chair of the European Union, but also a role model. Let me tell all participants in this dinner that Slovakia entered the euro area after Lehman Brothers, not before Lehman Brothers. Slovakia is one of the 4 countries, I would say it's the leader of the 4 countries that entered the euro area after the heat of the crisis, the peak of the financial crisis, the worst financial crisis ever since World War II. Only to compare the 15 before Lehman Brothers with member countries with the 19 that we are today gives, in my opinion, the best illustration of the mistakes are made in thinking that the euro area was promised to dismantling and evaporation. For an entity which was promised for evaporation to recruit 4 new members in the period of the crisis is something which is quite remarkable. So, dear Peter Kažimír, let me only say also that under your guidance, you are Minister of Finance since 2012, after having been State Secretary in the Minister of Finance for 2006 to 2010. So you played a very decisive part in the management of your country, which is considered by the OECD as a role model, as I already said, in terms of governance and in terms of growth. And a number of countries represented here would be a little bit jealous to hear that you are probably growing at a pace of 3.3% in 2017 and are expecting to grow by 4.1 or something in 2018. At least it is what the international financial institutions are forecasting for you. And you're aiming yourself at a balanced budget in 2019, which again would make a number of countries jealous. Still, of course, a lot of structural reforms are necessary, as those reforms are overdue in many, many countries in Europe. So, again, thank you so much for your having accepted to give us your own sentiment on what should be done, not only after having noted all the reform that the crisis triggered on the MIP, the SGP, the banking union front, on the ESM front. I mean, we have reformed the euro area and the European Union along at least 4 major dimensions. Some existed before, one, the SGP. The other 3 did not exist before. We have created the MIP, macroeconomic imbalance procedure. We have created banking union. We have created ESM. So we should not forget that in the crisis, the reaction of the euro area and of the European Union has been quite strong. We did not, maintain the statu quo ante, and we are not only satisfied to see new countries entering in, we reform also. But we don't expect you to say a lot, perhaps, on the past reform, but on the future reform. And there, of course, we are very, very depending on your own judgment, your own appreciation. You have demonstrated when leading and chairing the European Union that you were a reformer, even if reform is very, very complex and very difficult. You have the chance to have ideas, to have already floated ideas, to be on the position to float, perhaps, new ideas and new meditation and reflection at a moment where perhaps a window of opportunity is opening up. Everything was very difficult at the beginning of the year. Now, after what happened in the Netherlands, what happened in France, what is expected in Germany, we have the feeling that things are possible. And at that moment, of course, your own vision becomes very, very important. I would not be complete if I did not mention something that you know but deserves perhaps to be reminded. Bruegel is a think tank of exceptional quality. Everybody knows that in Brussels, but what is perhaps a little not as well known is that seen from Asia, seen from the United States of America, we are one of the best think tank in the world. And I think that it is worth mentioning that the University of Pennsylvania Global Go-To Think Tank Index has once again confirmed that we are ranked first in the world for best new idea or paradigm developed by a think tank, second in the world of think tanks in international economics. These are positions that are of extreme importance, that are recurrent, and that are, of course, a fantastic satisfaction for, if I may, Guntram, for all the team, for this entity which was starting from scratch only a few years ago, and I have also to mention for the board, and I am very pleased that the board is represented with very, very numerous members that are very proud, Guntram, of your work, of your hard work, together with the full team. Dear Peter, you have the floor.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Dear Guntram, dear Jean-Claude, thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you for very kind words about my country. I remember, just it was before 2009, my country joined to the Eurozone, and I was a part of this project. And just I would like to stress that still Slovaks and Slovak Republic is very proud member of Eurozone, and it's maybe only country in which public support to the euro, to the new currency, has been increased after joining to the Eurozone. I remember this figure was about 80%. 80% public support to the euro in 2009 after Lehman Brothers, the Jean-Claude, very severe times. Thank you for inviting. It's really refreshing and encouraging to learn that the ideas of Eurozone Finance Minister are still of merit, that we still have something to say. One small thing before we set sail, I need to warn you, I'm pretty pragmatic optimist. I cannot help it. I'm someone who is genuinely convinced that integrated Europe is the right and really only answer for the future of Europe. Tonight I would like to sketch out a path towards the creation of the fiscal union. To get there, we need to pass several checkpoints, including a full completion of the banking union, rainy day umbrellas shielding us from macro shocks, a smart fiscal rule book, new enforcement mechanism for fiscal rules, and a safe asset for the euro area. Does the Eurozone need to be reformed to such an extent? My answer to that is simple, very simple, yes. The crisis was ruthless in exposing weaknesses and flaws in the system. We have managed to contain and resolve some, yet a temporary quick fix is not going to be good enough. That's why the reform is inevitable. That's the reason why this time last year my country, Slovakia, took over the presidency, and we decided to stage a discussion on shock absorber mechanisms. In other words, on fiscal capacity. Many were trying to discourage us in this time. Many talk of integration fatigue, if you remember last year. We were all shocked by Britain's decision to leave the European Union, and we were nervously awaiting the outcome of the Dutch and French elections. My very, very experienced colleague Wolfgang Schäuble, all you know him, warned us already in 2012 that if the crisis is W-shaped, then after the economic trouble, political problem might follow. And he was right, wie immer. We all became worried that a tide of populist and anti-European forces could turn into a tsunami and cripple the European project. Luckily, that didn't happen. On the contrary, instead of doom and gloom, we were blessed with a unique window of opportunity. Really very unique for a very short time. Positive European sentiment and new burst of energy to push things forward. Right now, the godfathers of Europe and the godfathers of the euro, Paris and Berlin, are working together to use all that positive energy to draw up a roadmap and action plan, trying to outline how to make the multiverse, that it's our monetary union, more resilient and modern. The beauty of the Eurozone and the trouble with the Eurozone is that it is colorful and diverse. It binds together economies large and small, advance as well as catching up. Those with high levels of savings and capital and those with relatively more labor. This diversity is our strength, and this is really not just a cliché. It's obviously good for the smaller, weaker, less advanced members, but the larger and stronger economies also benefit. They share a currency with weaker economies, and so the exchange rate is lower than it otherwise would be. This is not just some academic point, it's an important fact of life that a diverse Eurozone naturally helps with the export performance of stronger economies. It was, if we are talking about a completion of the Eurozone, we need an architecture that is suitable for this variety of members. The problem is that we are often too attached to domestic politics. It's natural to cherry pick, to propose only integration solutions that our voters back home will like. I do understand, I'm a politician after all. I'm not saying we should go on a suicide mission, but some political capital will have to be spent on what needs to be done. For the Eurozone, we cannot just demand what we like and reject what we don't, what we used to do. We need an architecture where the individual blocks actually fit together. We may like some of these building blocks and dislike others, but nothing vital can be left out. Because while diversity brings benefits, as I said, to weaker economies as well as stronger economies, it also has costs which need to be addressed. For example, the member states of the Eurozone lose one of the most important domestic policy tools, the national monetary policy. And we all know the obvious consequences. No devaluation possible to deal with shocks, same interest rate for countries at different stages of development, different phases of business cycle, having to use fiscal space just to compensate for that, etc., etc. That's why, to make up for the loss of national monetary policy and for the constrained fiscal policy, there should be fiscal mechanisms at the central level. Indeed, in most successful monetary unions, this is precisely the case. That's the reason why my country, Slovakia, decided to stage a discussion on such common fiscal mechanisms. As I mentioned, many different mechanisms are possible. It doesn't matter what is the color of the umbrella, as long as it stops the rain. I want to stress, however, the fiscal capacity does not replace the need for fiscal discipline. On the contrary, I do believe that fiscal mechanisms and fiscal rules are complements. To be even more clear about it, fiscal capacity cannot possibly exist without fiscal discipline. It's quite sad that the crisis created a division and mistrust among member states. And in many minds, the common mechanisms became linked with irresponsibility. But we are where we are. In order to overcome mistrust on all sides, the debates on sharing risk and reducing risk need to go in parallel, in my view. Some countries would like to have more risk sharing, others more risk reduction. This debate reminds me of the film, excellent film, Lost in Translation. We cannot understand, agree with each other because none of us speak Japanese. Take the example of the banking union. A fully fledged, functioning banking union, obviously, requires the establishment of a common backstop. This needs to be fiscally neutral in the medium term. So it's really outside of the risk reduction and the risk sharing debate. However, when we come to the third pillar, the European Deposit Insurance Scheme, known as EDIS or EDIS. We cannot avoid that debate. There are legacy issues of the crisis, and we are still suffering from them. Because of these skeletons in the closet, we still haven't fully achieved the main aim of the banking union. I mean, to target to break the vicious circle between banks and sovereigns. To get to EDIS, we will also need to revisit the issue of the bank's exposure to their sovereigns. On the face of it, this is a risk reduction measure. However, the solutions that were proposed would restrict the ability of governments to sell their debt at the time of trouble when it is most needed. And I can tell you from personal experience that this is itself certainly doesn't mean a reduction of risk. Forcing a small, fiscally responsible country to rely on the mercy of the financial market constrained by this kind of regulation can make life quite difficult. It's different for larger countries, but please, most countries in the Eurozone are not actually that large. So if we go down this road, we need some kind of carrot. That is, some kind of safe asset through which fiscally responsible governments could finance themselves. The Eurobond, yes, taboo word. So the Eurobond would be the simple solution in terms of economics, but I don't need to tell you that it is by far the most difficult in terms of politics. So we need to look for alternatives. There are proposals on the table to create a safe asset without debt mutualization through financial engineering. The details are quite esoteric, so even for finance ministers, so I will not go into these details. But I do believe that with all the brainpower available, such a European safe asset should be possible. But here we come again to the issue of trust, especially trust in fiscal responsibility. What I would like to see, fight for, is a more integrated, stronger Eurozone built on modern fiscal and economic rules respected and followed by all countries with no double standards, no vague flexibilities and ambiguities, allowing shortcuts and bypasses. At the moment, the rules don't seem to be working very well. On the one hand, the complexity and density of the Stability and Growth Pact has increased over time, always with a good reason, of course. But the end result is now quite a top-heavy structure. And secondly, the current enforcement mechanism is questionable. On paper, everything works fine, but you know well how it is in practice. I don't need to tell you that SGP reform is not an easy task. The truth is that no matter how hard we try, we will never find fiscal rules that will work in every situation and for every member state. Admitting that the rules are not perfect, nobody is perfect and never will be, is the first step on a 12-step journey toward recovery. But one relatively painless way of making the SGP smarter and more growth-friendly would be to look at accounting conventions. Personally, rather than creating new flexibilities which muddle the picture, I would much prefer clear changes to the rules, which will then be strictly enforced. But now, how should this strict enforcement work? Either we create a much stronger centralized supervision, perhaps even including automatic sanctions, or we go back to basics and let the market decide the appropriateness of our actions, restoring the full credibility of so-called no-bailout rule. Both journeys have shortcomings and very, very hidden traps. Strict enforcement of imperfect rules by faceless men and women in Brussels, Frankfurt, or even Bratislava, I forgot Luxembourg, can spark further public dissatisfaction. It's a new centralized authority had a power. If a new centralized authority had the power to punish countries for their fiscal sins, I think such loss of sovereignty would be too much for many member states, especially today when the populace anger is lower but not gone. It would add more fuel to the fire. If the extremists cry out against the dictate from Brussels now, we can just imagine what they would be saying tomorrow. Moreover, automatic sanctions would require that the rules were ideal, fit for every country and every situation. As I already said, this is really utopia. But if the sanctions are not automatic, then politics will always intrude, and we would be back where we are today. The second way, a fully credible no bailout rule, basically means introducing an insolvency procedure for sovereigns. That is very, very hot potato. The market is not always the most rational animal. As I suggested before, every finance minister is fully aware how much markets can overreact. And I think that most politicians, if they were asked, and an institution, the most politicians, if they were asked to choose between the market and an institution, would almost always go for the institution, for somebody they can follow up and talk to. But keeping in our comfortable ways is exactly what has gotten us here in the first place. If we are serious about enforcement, we need to avoid political interference as much as possible. They may be a place for institutions to provide correct assessment of the fiscal health of member states, since markets don't process information perfectly. The independent fiscal councils in my country and other member states work quite well, I think. They may be role models for European body. But more importantly, and thankfully, we can put checks on the market, dampen its overreaction, and improve its functioning. After all, the markets could even help through private risk sharing once we complete the capital markets union. So I think a full no bailout rule could work if all the proper checks and balances on the market are in place. Specifically, a fully functioning banking union, common mechanisms against shocks, and last but definitely not least, the European safe asset. These are all pieces of the puzzle that actually fit together and support each other. Let me explain how. If we have an insolvency procedure for sovereigns, then the completed banking union is obviously necessary. Otherwise, the insolvency of one member state could threaten the national banking system and then in turn drag down the financial system in the rest of the Eurozone. I already explained the need for fiscal capacity, but it becomes even more important under the full no bailout rule. We must have a cushion for those shocks which are a little too large for national fiscal policy, but not quite bad enough for the ESM. The fiscal capacity should step in and prevent such moderate shocks from turning into catastrophic ones. Finally, the safe asset is needed in order to prevent self-fulfilling prophecies when market overreaction pushes countries into insolvency, even though there is no good fundamental reason for that. This would be an ambitious architecture, indeed. However, it's a way in which all the pieces of the puzzle would fit together. I am convinced the monetary union has to be complemented with a fiscal union. Despite all the difficulties and controversies of a model where some countries get more integrated, but this also affects other countries that for now stayed out for outs. It won't be easy, and it will take time. This kind of political integration goes understandably beyond the absorption capacity of many politicians and voters, but it has to happen. We should stop trying to compete with each other and cooperate more in order to compete with the rest of the world. I'm not saying the way I sketch out here is the only way. The end result will probably be different. What I'm saying is what I suggested at the beginning, that we cannot cherry-pick our way to completing the Eurozone. The end result will necessarily be compromise, hopefully the kind of compromise where everyone gets something they want, not a compromise which leaves everyone unhappy. Either way, all the pieces need to fit together. Sharp edges will need to be rounded. That's the only way to create an architecture suitable for the whole of the diverse Eurozone. Long story short, we need delivery to get ahead of the curve for once. We should be truthful and genuine when talking about further integration, not just pretending to be nice. We need to know what we really want. We need to be ready to burn the midnight oil to get there, and there is never the sweet without the sour. I do believe we don't have much of choice here if winning is what we are striving for, and if we want to prove to Europeans that the European project is really the best option that exists. For me, the best option and end game is a fiscal union. A union with institutions and instruments designed to fortify all of the Eurozone with real powers and responsibilities, accompanied by fiscal capacity to shield our economies and financial sectors from harm. Thank you. This is my view. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much for this smashing exposition. We are at the heart of the reform of the euro area and of the European Union, of course. So I'm expecting a lot of questions on the various concepts you have manipulated, if I may. I am very impressed by what you said on the fiscal